Once upon a time, there lived an extremely beautiful woman whose father was rich. Her name was Nike, and she was the daughter of a multi-billionaire. Nike was so quiet and reserved that people could hardly tell that her family was wealthy. During her time in university, she insisted on living in the school hostel, even when she knew that she could afford the most expensive house around. She never loved to flaunt her wealth because she believed strongly in humility. One day, Nika was heading to her father's office when she caught sight of a building which was being demolished. Nika could not help but notice a young man who looked extremely devastated. She felt so terrible for him, guessing that his devastation had something to do with the collapsed building. She arrived at her father's office but could not take her mind off the young man that she saw. Nike decided to head back to the demolition site when she came across the young man who was about jumping off a nearby bridge. Her heart raced as she saw him standing at the edge of the bridge, staring down at the raging waters below. Without thinking twice, Nike rushed towards the man. She pleaded for him not to end his life, and the man informed her that there was nothing left to live for. "There's nothing left for me. All that I've ever worked for is gone. My dream, my building, and even my will to live." Nike stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Ending your life won't solve anything. I don't know your story, but I know that you're worth more than this moment." For a long while, the young man stared at her, but something in Nike's eyes, a mix of compassion and strength, stopped him from taking the final step. He stepped away from the edge of the bridge, his body shaking as he thanked Nike for saving his life. The young man, whose name was Timmy, began to narrate his life story to her. The building, which had just been demolished, was his life's work, a small promising tech office which he built from scratch. A court dispute over land ownership had led to its demolition, and just like that, Timmy's dreams were reduced to rubble. Nike listened intently as he poured out his heart to her. She could not believe what he had been through and decided to help. Nike introduced Timmy to her father, who agreed to help him out. Timmy could not believe how life had decided to smile down at him. His tech startup took off again, and not long afterwards, investors began to pour in, and his small dream transformed into a bustling empire. Timmy couldn't believe how his life had transformed, from standing on the edge of a bridge to leading meetings in glass-walled conference rooms. Nike stood by his side every step of the way, encouraging him and offering a quiet strength that he had come to rely on. In the midst of his success, Timmy began to develop feelings for Nike. They spent time together and soon became an item. One day, whilst Nike and Timmy were walking out of the cinema, a beautiful young woman walked up to him to introduce herself. Her name was Miwa, and she was tall, elegant, and carried herself with an air of superiority. Her makeup was flawless, and her designer outfits screamed wealth and privilege. She walked straight to Timmy and extended her perfectly manicured hand. "Hello, Timmy. I'm Miwa," she said with a smile on her face. Timmy hesitated before shaking her hand, his mind wondering who she was. "Do I know you?" he asked, as Miwa laughed softly, ignoring Nike, who was standing next to him. She ignored Nike completely, acting as though she was invisible. "Not yet, but soon you'll get to know me. I've been following your company's success, and I must say that I'm very impressed. I think we have a lot to discuss. Over dinner, perhaps?" she asked Timmy as she handed him her phone to input his number. Timmy, still reeling in shock, gave Miwa his number as she promised to give him a call. Nike, who was standing there all along, could feel her chest tighten. Miwa's blatant disregard for her presence was not just disrespectful, it felt like an insult to her very existence. But Nike kept her composure, trying so hard not to create a scene in public. They walked to the car, and Nike remained quiet. Timmy could not help but notice her silence. He reached out for her hand and asked if she was fine, and Nike forced a smile. "I'm fine, Timmy. I just don't feel comfortable with her." "There's something about her that doesn't sit right with me," Nike said to Timmy, who assured her that he had everything under control. He squeezed her hand, assuring her that she was the one that he loved. Nike smiled weakly, but her heart remained unsettled. Miwa's confident arrogance and dismissive attitude had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. In the weeks that followed, Miwa's presence became impossible to ignore. She started showing up at Timmy's office frequently, sending expensive gifts and inviting him to exclusive dinners and business events. Nike brought it up again one evening while they were having dinner. "Timmy, she's everywhere. She's always calling you, texting you and showing up at your office unannounced. I don't like this, Timmy." "Nike," Timmy said, setting down his fork. "Miwa is just business. She's helping the company secure some big deals. Please, don't let this come between us." Nike sighed and let the matter rest, but deep down, she knew that Miwa had something up her sleeves. Despite the tension, Timmy proposed to Nike on her birthday. It was such a pleasing surprise, as Nike did not see it coming. She sat there admiring her ring when she got a call that her parents had been kidnapped. "We have your parents. If you want to see them alive again, bring 200 million naira in cash within 72 hours. No police or they die." Nike's world came crashing down. She sat there as she watched her world crashing on her. Nike could not believe her eyes. She did everything within her power to meet the kidnappers' demands, but even after the ransom was paid, the kidnappers did not release her parents. Days later, she received another call, a call that shattered her world forever. "You'll find them at the old factory on Lekki Road," the caller said as the line went dead. Nike rushed as fast as she could to the factory, but when she arrived, she met the cold, lifeless bodies of her parents. Her screams echoed through the empty factory as she was confronted with several dead bodies. Nike could feel her heart rip through her chest, knowing that her parents were lying there lifeless. Her parents were gone, and Nike had no idea how she would survive without them. After their funeral, Nike's uncle swooped in like vultures. They produced documents claiming that her father left no will. So, they seized all his properties and assets, leaving Nike with nothing. "Nike," one uncle said, "a woman like you has no right to inherit any property. You should count yourself lucky that we even let you keep the clothes on your back." Nike stood there as she watched her uncles, who treated her nicely when her parents were alive, turn their backs on her now. Nike left her father's mansion broken. She made her way to Timmy, who opened his doors and welcomed her into his home. "You are always welcome here," he said to Nike, who clung on to him, broken and vulnerable. Months passed, and Timmy began to treat Nike like a burden. He never spoke of their wedding plans again, and whenever Nike brought up the topic, he flared up and asked why she was so desperate to get married. The love he had for her had fizzled away, and every day that passed was filled with more arguments. Timmy was now distant, and his once warm and reassuring presence was now replaced by cold indifference. The man who had once promised to stand by her side no matter what had become a stranger who she struggled to recognize. Nike tried to ignore the growing distance between them, hoping that it was just stress from work, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Miwa was still lingering in the shadows. Her presence had even become more pronounced than before. Nike decided to speak to Timmy about it. She waited for him to return from work, but Timmy did not return home that evening. She called him severally, but he didn't pick up. Nike stayed up all night, hoping and praying that nothing had happened to him. She could not stand the thought of anything bad happening to him after all the tragedy that she had endured in the past. When morning came, Timmy returned home with no explanation of where he spent the night. Nike confronted him, but Timmy informed her that he had the right to do whatever he wanted. "I am the man in this relationship, and you dare not question my authority," he said to Nike, who stood there shocked to hear such from him. She sat there broken as his voice replayed in her head over and over again. The days that followed were one of the worst for Nike, who who had no food to eat in the house. Timmy stopped providing food and money for her. He ensured to eat before he returned home, not caring that Nike had no food to eat. The tension between them grew unbearable as Nike began to feel like a stranger in the home where she once felt safe. One evening, as heavy rain poured relentlessly from the sky, Nike heard a loud knock on the door. She opened the door to see Miwa standing there. She was dressed in an expensive dress and her hair was perfectly styled despite the rainy weather. "Timmy invited me over," Miwa said smugly as she pushed Nike aside and stepped into the house. Nike could feel her chest tighten. She followed Miwa into the living room where Timmy was already seated, sipping a glass of whiskey. "Timmy, what is she doing here?" she asked in a shaky voice as Timmy set down his glass and looked up at her. His face contorted with anger. "She is here because I invited her," he said with no remorse in his voice. "Miwa here is a woman that you would never be. She will be staying here with me, and I would like you to pack your filthy bags now and leave my house." Miwa smirked as she took a seat next to Timmy, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the armrest as she stared at Nike, who stood there frozen and unable to speak. The sound of the rain beat against the windows as Nike tried to hold back her tears. She reminded Timmy of how she stood by him when he had nothing. "I took you to my father, and my father used his connections to make you who you are today." Timmy laughed to her face and told her to tell her dead father to use his connections to come back to life. "If your father was as powerful as you claim, he wouldn't be dead today, so miss me with your bullshit talk," he said to Nike, who he told to leave his house. Nike could not believe that Timmy was sending her out because of another woman. She stood there for a minute as she stared at Miwa and Timmy, who were now kissing in her presence. Nike could not control her anger. She asked Timmy why he decided to choose Miwa over her after all that they had been through, and Timmy informed her that she was useless to him. "Without your father, you are nothing but a liability to me. What will I be doing with a woman who relies on me for everything? You can't even afford your sanitary pad. Talk more of contributing anything meaningful in my life," he said to her as he pushed her out of his house into the rain. Nike could hear their mocking laughter as she stood outside the house. She stood there heartbroken as she could not believe that Timmy would ever do such a thing to her. She wept bitterly as the thought of her late parents crossed her mind. Nike had nowhere else to go. The weather was extremely cold and Nike began to plead with Timmy to forgive her. "Timmy, I have nowhere else to go. Please don't do this to me," she said to Timmy, who ignored her cries as he left her under the pouring rain. Miwa stood by the window as she laughed aloud, enjoying every second of Nike's humiliation. The rain was so heavy, drenching Nike to the bone as she stood outside the house. Her suitcase sat at her feet, soaking up the muddy water. She stared at the door, hoping and praying that Timmy would come out and take her in, but Timmy left her to her fate. The storm roared around her, but the pain in her chest was even louder. "I wish you were here, Mama and Papa," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so lost without you." The world felt cold, empty and cruel. Nike remembered how her father always shielded her from the rain whenever he was around. He would take off his jacket and place above her head, not caring that the rain was pouring down on him. He sacrificed so much for her, and Nike wished that he was still alive. Her tears poured as the memories came rushing back. As the rain continued to fall, a day, the security officer from the neighboring house approached her and offered to let her stay in his home. Nike could not believe her ears. She quickly rushed to his little gatehouse as the rain had soaked into her bones. Ade, who was a kind-hearted man, began to take care of her. He opened the door to his little room, which was small and clean. "My boss traveled out of the country and won't be back for weeks," Ade explained as he assured Nike that she could stay. Nike sat in the corner as she thanked him for his kindness. He provided her with food as well as every other living essential, and Nike was so grateful to him. She could not believe that Timmy would do such a terrible thing to her after all that she did for him. Heartbroken and dejected, Nike decided to pick up the remaining pieces of her life. She could not keep wallowing in self-pity after what Timi had done to her. Timi, on the other hand, chose Miwa because of how rich she was. Miwa was the daughter of a minister, and Timi hoped to use her connections to secure funding for his new app. After Nike's father's death, Timi began to struggle with his finances. He saw Miwa as his only way out and didn't mind letting go of Nike. What he did not know was that things were not as simple as he thought. One morning, as Timi got out of the house, he saw Nike and Ade having a laugh. Timi stormed towards them, his face contorted with anger and his voice sharp as a knife. "Nike, look at you," he spat out, his eyes scanning her simple dress and sandals. "Are you not ashamed of yourself? Of all the people you could have chosen to live with, you chose a mere gate man, and you are not ashamed to stand here, laughing with this miserable thing." Nike froze for a moment, her smile fading slightly as she stared at me with an expression that was no longer filled with heartbreak, but with strength. She began speaking, her voice steady and clear, despite the fire that burned in her chest. "Do you hear yourself? You stand there, dressed in clothes bought with someone else's money, standing on borrowed time, and yet you think you have the right to ridicule me?" Timi froze, his mouth slightly open as he stood there, stunned by her boldness. "You threw me out like trash, humiliated me in the rain, and laughed as I begged for mercy at your doorstep. And now, here I am, with someone who showed me more kindness and humanity than you ever did in all the time that I stood by your side." Ade shifted slightly, but said nothing. He let Nike speak, his silent presence a pillar of support for her. Nike stepped forward, her eyes locked on that of Timi. "You call Ade a mere gate man, but let me remind you, it was this mere gate man who picked me up when I was broken, gave me shelter, and treated me with respect when you treated me like a burden." Timi's face turned red with embarrassment, but Nike wasn't done. "You lost me, Timi, not because of Miwa, not because of your greed, but because you failed to see my worth. And now you stand here trying to drag me down again. But let me tell you this, I refuse to let you have power over me. Not this time." Timi stood there confused as Miwa angrily walked up to them. "What's going on here?" Miwa said, with a voice laced with anger, but Nike laughed and told her to drop the act. Miwa then approached Nike and shook her hand. "It was nice working with you, ma," she said as she looked Timi in the eyes and revealed to him how foolish he was to let Nike go. "You really thought I was the minister's daughter? How stupid of you to think that." Timi stood there shocked as he tried to understand what was happening. What he did not know was that Nike's father hired Miwa to test his love for his daughter. Her father, after seeing how Timi came into his daughter's life, could not risk his daughter falling into the hands of a man who only loved her for his wealth. So he contracted Miwa to pose as the minister's daughter to see if Timi would fall for her. Timi stood there frozen, his mouth slightly open as the weight of Miwa's words sank in. "You are working for Nike's father all along?" Timi stammered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Miwa smirked, crossing her arms. "Yes, Timi. Every move I made, every smile, every text message, it was all part of the plan. You were tested and you failed woefully. Your actions prove that you are not worthy of Nike's love." Nike stood there, her posture confident, her eyes shining with clarity and strength. "My father loved me too much to let me fall into the hands of a man who would trade me for a few coins and political favors. Everything, the test, the betrayal were all planned." Timi's knees buckled as he staggered backwards. However, she did not lose everything to her uncles as Timi had thought. Her father left a will, but Nike kept this fact hidden, knowing that her uncles would try to claim her father's wealth. She only gave them access to a small portion of his wealth just to achieve her goal. Nike was still in possession of everything that her father ever owned, as her father's will gave her possession of all his wealth. Timi's face turned pale as the weight of Nike's words settled over him. The realization that he had been nothing more than a pawn in a carefully orchestrated plan hit him like a sledgehammer. As they stood there, Ade, who had quietly watched the whole thing play out, stepped forward and approached Nike. He handed her a small envelope containing photos that showed Timi's involvement in her parents' kidnap and death. Nike could not believe her eyes. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the photos. Each image painted a horrifying story. Timi speaking with the kidnappers, exchanging documents, and handing over details that could have only come from someone close to their family. Her knees felt weak, but she tried so hard to hold herself together. "You were involved in my parents' death?" Nike's voice wavered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Timi stuttered, stepping back, his face pale. "Nike, it's not what it looks like. I didn't mean for it to go that far." "Stop!" Nike's voice cracked like thunder. "You betrayed my family. You betrayed me, and you caused the death of my parents, all for money." Timi dropped to his knees, his hands clasped together. "Nike, please, I was desperate. I was drowning in debt. I didn't want them dead. I just wanted the money. But along the line, they tried to escape and we are shot." "No more lies, Timi." Ade caught him, his voice cold and authoritative. "We have enough evidence to prove that you wanted to kill them, so as to marry their daughter and take over all that her father ever owned. The photos, the call logs, the money transfers is all there." Nike turned away from Timi, her heart shattering into a million pieces all over again. Ade pulled out his phone and signaled to the team waiting nearby. Moments later, police cars screeched to a halt outside the house. Armed officers stormed in, handcuffing Timi as he wailed and pleaded for mercy. "Nike, please! Nike, forgive me!" Timi screamed as the officers dragged him away. All the while, Nike had thought that Ade was just a gatesman. What she did not know was that he was a detective with the Special Crimes Unit. Her father had hired him long before he passed away to watch over his daughter. He had his suspicions about Timi and asked Ade to keep a close eye on him. Nike let out a shaky breath. "All this time, you are watching over me?" Ade smiled as he apologized to Nike for all the pain that she had to endure. "We needed to gather solid evidence to bring Timi to justice. That's why I kept my identity hidden for this long." Nike nodded as tears poured down her eyes. "Thank you, Ade. Thank you for everything that you did for us." Ade gave her a reassuring smile. "You're stronger than you realize, Miss Nike. Your father would be so proud of you," he said as he stepped into the police van and drove away. In the weeks that followed, Nike stepped fully into her father's empire, reclaiming every stolen piece of her legacy. The will, now made public, revealed her father's wishes explicitly. Everything he owned was to be passed on to his beloved daughter, Nike. Her uncles, who had once swooped in like vultures, were forced to relinquish their stolen assets. They were publicly shamed and cut off from the family fortune forever. Nike became the CEO of her father's vast empire, and her return to power was celebrated across the nation. The newspapers ran headlines such as "Nike Adebayo, rising from the ashes. Billionaire heiress restores her father's legacy." Her composure, humility and grace, despite the betrayals and heartbreak that she had faced, earned her widespread admiration. Ade, who had played a vital role in exposing Timi and bringing justice to Nike's family, was promoted within the Special Crimes Unit. He remained a trusted friend of Nike, who rewarded him with a huge sum of money for all the times that he helped her. One day, as Nike sat with Ade in her office, she asked how he got the photos, and Ade revealed to her that a photographer who was taking pictures close to the factory heard some weird voices and decided to check. He saw everything play out and took photos without them knowing. Nike broke down in tears as she imagined the pain that her parents went through. Ade comforted and assured her that everything would be fine, and Nike let out a faint smile as she stared at her father's photograph, which was hanging in his office. Timi, however, was sentenced to life in prison. He lived the remainder of his life in regret and wished that he never allowed greed to take control of his life. The lesson to be learned from this story is that true character is revealed in moments of power and adversity. Never allow greed, arrogance, or a thirst for wealth to blind you to the people who truly care about you. Always remember that integrity, loyalty, and humility are the greatest treasures a person can ever possess. I hope you enjoyed the story.
If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, share what you learned in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales like this one. Thank you.